Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week's episode is our Wilds of Eldraine State of the Format Address episode. So, if you haven't been listening to the podcast for too long, if you're newer, you haven't joined us for one of these State of the Format Address episodes, you're in for a bit of a treat. These are usually our juiciest episodes, the most info-dense episodes. Essentially, what these are is I've jammed a bunch of drafts this week, learned a ton about the format, and I'm here to share as much as I can with you, those that haven't been winning that much. Hopefully, this is gonna fill you in, catch you up in the format. And if you have been winning a bunch, you can just bob your head along in agreement, confirm some things that you are feeling about the format. And even if you are doing pretty well in the format, I'm sure you're gonna pick up a few tidbits here and there along the way. But really, this is the let's get everybody up to speed. If you've been faltering, struggling, flailing in this format, I want to point out some places that you might be falling into some traps. I want to share where I've had successes, and as a streamer, as somebody who engages with the community a lot, I have a good sense, I think, of where people are falling into traps. So definitely going to want to touch on that. Also, going to do my due diligence here, as I often do. There is a arena open this weekend, September the 16th and the 17th. It is draft day 2, sealed day 1, so we're back to that format. I know people sometimes get a little bit confused when they log onto arena on the weekend and they're like, oh, wait a second, there's arena open this weekend. They don't advertise them very well, and I'm here to try to do that because, I don't want people to miss out on these if they want to play them. So, that's what we're here for today. Buckle in, we got a lot to talk about. But of course, just before we do, I want to check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelup. So you can go there. If you like what we're doing here, you want to support the show, you want to support any of my content, honestly. That's the number one place you can go to support what I'm doing, either on the stream or on the YouTube or my Channel Fireball articles. Also, we've got a lot of reward tiers over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support the show. I want to help get you better at Limited. That's really the goal here. And there's a bunch of rewards over there, ranging from coaching rewards to Discord rewards, deck tech help rewards, all the things that, if you feel like you need a little bit of a bump, a little bit of a nudge to get to that next level, just another reason why you might want to check out the Patreon. So if you want to support or you want to get that little bit of a level up, go check it out, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. All right, let's jump in with a segment called the Vibe Check. And this is just a quick little thing I like to do at the beginning of these State of the Format episodes, touching on the slightly lesser strategic side of the format, the general community opinion of the format, what's happening, do I like this format? And to put it succinctly, and this is, my opinion, tied in with what I've heard from other people in the community's opinion, is this is a fast format, but it's still fun, and there's a little bit of something for everybody. I would pretty confidently say that this is a fast format. This is a format that you feel the pain of not having a 2-drop on turn 2 when your opponent does. It's a format where often curves begin on turn 1. It's a format where a lot of the powerful cards are the cheap ones. A lot of the power is just focused on the 1 and 2 and 3 mana cards. And so as I was playing the first few days of the format, I was like, well, I don't know, I'm kind of worried. I'm worried that people aren't going to like the format because it is one of those formats where you do feel like you have to get on board super early. Generally, the trend that I've seen amongst the Magic community is, at least the vocal people out there, they don't like that much, right? People like when the games have a little bit of time to breathe, where the game isn't about these micro decisions of what land to play on turn 2 and when to use your trick on turn 3 or hold that. Like, those are the kind of decisions that a lot of players do like, myself included, but a lot of other players, that's not where they get their kicks, right? They get their kicks off of casting cool 5 and 6 mana spells that, mind you, I'm not saying is strategically a bad thing, in fact, is a good thing in this format to do. But some people just don't like that all early game type of gameplay, right? They want to be, they got a little bit of Johnny in them. Basically, they want to cast their big spells. And, I was surprised to some degree when the early days of my chat, a lot of people were saying, I really like this format. It's really, really fun. I'm having a really good time. It's a little bit fast, but I'm still having a really good time. And I think that's a testament to a few things. One is a testament to getting green right. Like, a lot of the past formats, green has been kind of dorky, and the, just the strategy of play a bunch of colors and ramp to your big things has not been particularly effective. And I think that exists here. If you play any amount of this set, you'll know that Hamlet Glutton and the green ramp decks, that's a strong thing to do. And that counterbalances the aggro to some extent, right? It means there is a variety of types of games you can play, a variety of decks you can draft. People don't like formats when it's all aggro and it's the only viable thing, but that's definitely not the case in this format. And, a testament to the mechanics too, I think that Adventure is just a great limited mechanic, really fun, Really fun, just the decision of, okay, when do I cast this early? Do I cast a little bit later? The decision in this set where do you splash the off-color adventures? Do you just play the creature side and not worry about getting that, that green mana into your deck for Picnic Ruiner? And I think Bargain's pretty fun too. I think that the puzzle of, okay, what do you sacrifice to your bargain things? Can you sacrifice something that gives you value when you sacrifice it? Hatching Plans comes to mind, but even something like a Hopeful Vigil or a Hopeless Nightmare, something you're like, ooh, I get to sack this, scry 2, get a big effect. I think the mechanics and the cards play well. So even though it is a bit of a quick format, and we're going to touch on what you need to do to accommodate for that, there's still a lot of room for a bunch of different kind of decks. And I think just the cards are fun, and that pulls a lot of weight. But yeah, in any case, the format's fun. I would recommend it if you haven't dipped your toe in just yet. And for the folks like me who've been drafting a bunch, the real test is going to come on week 3, 4, 5, 6 of the format. We're only in week, 1.5. But at that point, it's going to be like, well, do I still want to get into the draft queue on week 6, or would I rather jump into Cube? We'll see. I imagine this set actually does have enough legs to be one of those ones where you draft it to the bitter end, but, time will tell. All right, let's move on, jumping in with some action here, starting with some big picture ideas. So the way I like to structure these State of the Format episodes is I start broad. I start with the concepts, the ideas that are going to be relevant draft in, draft out, game in, game out. The ones that if you just walked away from this podcast after listening to the first 15 minutes, I think you could apply a lot of what I'm talking about. And then we narrow in, right, to the more specific stuff, the archetypes, individual cards, stuff that you're going to have to worry about. Not every single draft, but, it's good to have certain tools in your tool belt. And I also really like to start with the ideas and the concepts that I think will help paint the best and most accurate picture of the format. Sometimes that thing I talk about is an archetype or mechanics. Maybe there's a deck that's so good that it influences how you should view the format, or a color that's so good. And mainly the thing that right now is helping me understand the format better, and I think is the thing that I'm going to try to bring to the table here, is really a deep dive on what each color is doing. Why you'd want to get into red or black, or what are the stronger or weaker colors. I think most people kind of have a little bit of sense of that, but I really do want to dive in and talk about what each color brings to the table and what you should be thinking about when you're drafting them. So we're going to talk about all 5 colors and exactly that, what you're looking for when you're drafting those colors. But there are 2 big picture ideas that I want to touch on before we get into that. I think they're going to give a little bit of context to the cards that we talk about when we actually jump into the colors. So let's start with those. Okay, so first concept I want to touch on is something that is near and dear to my heart, something I love as a Magic player, and that's cheap cards. I can't get enough of the cheap cards in this format. And the number one thing that I have been telling people that, if you're struggling, if you're feeling, hey, this format's super fast, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, I keep getting run over, I feel like I can't ever win when I'm on the draw. If those are your feelings about the format right now, I would just guess that you're underrating some or a lot of the cheap cards and not drafting them as highly as you should. I think a blanket statement that I feel comfortable attributing to the cheap cards is that the cheap cards are good. The cheap cards are strong, especially relative to the expensive cards in this set. There's just not that many good 4, 5, 6 mana cards. Not to say they don't exist, but a lot of the commons and uncommons, the power is really focused on the 1, 2, and 3 mana cards. And when I say cheap cards, I do mean 1, 2, and 3 mana cards. But really, if I'm to be picky, I would say 1 and 2 mana cards. I think right now, people aren't prioritizing the good 1 and 2 mana cards where they should, especially the ones, because there are a lot of good 1-drops or 1 mana spells. Obviously, you've got the great cards like Torch the Tower, which is the single red mana deal 2, but you can deal 3 if you bargain it. There's Candy Grapple, 2 mana, -3, -3, -5 if you bargain it. I think these cards are pretty obvious and do get picked highly. But then you've got stuff like Rat Out, which is a great card that we're going to touch on a little bit more as we get into talking about the cards. Single black mana, -1/-1 instant. You make a 1/1 rat token. Something like Harried Spear Guard. I think your aggro decks in this format are really looking to just be a bunch of 1-drops and a bunch of 2-drops. As many of those you can possibly get. Harried Spear Guard among them. 1 mana, 1/1 haste, that when it dies, you make a rat token. Ginger Brute, another great cheap card. I think every color has one good 1 mana card, at least one good 1 mana card. Some have multiple, especially when you get to the uncommons. And I want to clarify here, this dynamic at play here where the cheap cards are good isn't just, oh, aggro is strong in this format, you need cheap cards to keep up. I mean, that is definitely true as an aspect of the format, but aggro isn't the whole format, right? That's part of the format. You're going to face aggro draft in, draft out. It's good to have cheap cards, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Really, what it comes down to is the cheap cards pull their weight, mana for mana, pound for pound, more than the expensive cards. There are some really good expensive cards like Hamlet Glutton, which is the 7 mana, but usually 5 mana, 6/6 trample that gains 3 life. That card's one of the standouts, probably the best expensive common. There's stuff like Into the Fate Court, which is the 5 mana draw 3. You make a fairy token that can only block flyers. You've got stuff like Scream Puff, which is the 5 mana black 4/5 death touch that when it connects, you make a food. Like, you've got some good to serviceable cards in there, but you know, I'm kind of talking about exceptions here. There's also a lot of 4 mana cards, 5 mana cards, that common and uncommon, that you just go through and you're like, I don't really want this card in my deck very much. Something that really amplifies this cheap cards being the good cards dynamic is you have to ask yourself, why are you putting certain cards in your deck? Like, why do you put a 5-drop in your deck? Well, when you get to 5 mana, you'd like to do something with your 5 mana. You'd like something that is good at that point in the game, right? Why are you putting cheap cards in your deck? Well, you're going to want to have some cheap cards in your opening hand. You don't want to be spending no mana until turn 3, right? And I'm just talking about just Magic in general, not necessarily this format. In formats where your expensive cards have some sort of a buyout, like think about Lord of the Rings, right? The land cyclers. We very commonly play those good land cyclers, Lorien Revealed, the Troll, and I'm already forgetting the names. It's only been a few weeks, but you know, Troll of Khazad-dûm and Lorien Revealed, that cycle of cards. We were very happy to play multiple of those because they have a mode that's good in the early game. That dynamic has actually flipped in this set, where instead of a lot of the expensive cards having a cheap buyout mode that you can use early in the game, a lot of the cheap cards have expensive modes that you can cast when you draw them later in the game. Adventure, of course, is a really good example of this. All the adventure cards are kind of like this. They give you a place to put your mana when you've drawn your 2 or 3 mana card in the late game. But also bargain cards, right? All the bargain cards, which, you know, bargain is essentially just a variant of kicker, which kicker is famously known for the good early, good late. That's like it as a mechanic, right? That's its whole claim to fame. Bargain's the same thing. Something like Archon's Glory, a single mana white combat trick +2/+2, but if it was bargained, the creature gets flying and lifelink. Well, that +2/+2 trick is going to be pretty good on turns, 2 to 4, where your opponent's tapping out pretty consistently and your combat trick's not going to get gotten by an interaction spell. And, the board is small enough where +2/+2 is actually going to be a combat trick that your opponent can't play around that well. But when you draw this card later, just a +2/+2 combat trick, it's not going to be as good. It's got a good mode, though. It's got to send my thing to the sky and deal you the last 4 or 5 points or something, right? A lot of the bargain cards are like that, where you have these cheap cards that are great in your opening hand, but are also really good as the game goes on. So I really just want to hammer this home that if you're enticed by some of these expensive cards, just remember that a lot of your cheap cards do what you're hoping your expensive cards are going to do anyways. Give something to you that you can do as the game goes on, while being great in your opening hand still. And that's really what you're looking for a card in this format. Something that's good in your opening hand, because if it's not good in your opening hand, well, your entire deck has to kind of accommodate for that, right? There are some cards that are good enough that it's like, okay, this card's not good in my opening hand, but my whole deck is, a bunch of cheap interaction and I'm going to survive. I'm not going to die early. That's not standard though, right? You really want to make sure that when your opponent goes turn 1 Gingerbrute, you're not just dead in the water if they slap they slap a roll on it and go to town. And also, like, this isn't saying like, oh, you have to answer every single one of your opponent's cheap threats. You can be the person with the cheap threats too, right? That's the thing. Your opponent plays a Gingerbrute, they start attacking, and if you feel dead every single time your opponent plays a Gingerbrute on turn 1, you're probably playing a deck that's like too slow or doesn't have enough interaction, right? It's okay to have the expensive cards in your deck. Just make sure you're counterbalancing that by good interaction and good early plays as well. Just to give a little bit of an example here on how this, just take the cheap cards can apply to both decks on the very aggressive end of the spectrum and the very not aggressive, attrition-y end of the spectrum. I've got 2 decks here in front of me. And for people who are listening audio only, don't worry, you're not missing out too much. Really what I wanted to illustrate with this, I have a red-white, basically mono-red aggro deck, a few white cards in there. Just wanted to highlight what I'm really talking about with the curve. My curve has a Gingerbrute, 3 Harried Spear Guards, a Dragon's Mantle, a Monstrous Rage, and a Torch the Tower in the 1-drop slot. All right, so that's like, 7 1-mana spells. And then the 2-mana slot has something like 10 spells. I've got a bunch of Grand Ball Guests and a bunch of Ratcatcher Trainees, 4 of those, which is a little bit, atypical, I will say. But the Ratcatcher Trainees make it so that I don't have problems hitting my 5th land, or I don't mind hitting my 5th land, I should say, right? Like, I'm playing 17 lands in this deck, and we're going to get into land counts a little bit later, but I do think you should really be playing 17 lands in this format, even in your aggressive decks with adventures, because, well, they have adventures, you have places to put your mana. I've also got 2 Imodane's Recruiter, which is another place I can put my mana with a 5-mana adventure. So this is a deck where I never got flooded. Not just because some games I killed my opponent on turn 5, but because even in the games that went long, my adventure cards, like the trainees and the recruiters, gave me something to do in the late game without actually needing to put a 5-drop in my deck. Right, I don't need, like, flood insurance, quote unquote, because my flood insurance, it already comes, it's a package deal, right? It already comes with my cards. I don't need to worry about that game state. I've got built-in protection. And then, very much on the other side of the spectrum here, we've got this base green, Sultai, I've got some black removal, some blue card draw, mostly base green, this grindy, attrition-y, very much the opposite of what that red-white aggro deck was doing, where that deck's trying to win on turn 5. This one's probably incapable of winning by turn 5. This deck is still successful in the format. I've got a bunch of cheap stuff. Yes, I'm a deck that's looking to cast into the Fate Court, which the 5 mana, 3 blue, draw 3, make a 1/1 fairy token. That's a strong card, as long as you've got enough cheap stuff in your deck. And just like that red deck, I've got a bunch of cheap stuff in this one. I've got about 12 things to do before turn 3, which is a really good number. And again, you don't mind loading your deck with cheap things because something like Brave the Wilds, which is the single green mana, go get a land, well, you can bargain that later, make it 3/3. Hey, that's still a really impactful thing to draw in the late game. This is all just to say that I think that decks on either end of the spectrum can exist. These like late super outgrind you late game value decks, or the kill you as fast as you can decks. But what's important to both of them is that they have cheap cards and they're not overloaded on expensive cards. The aggro decks don't want to be overloaded on expensive cards because they can't afford not to curve out, and the grindier decks don't want to be overloaded on the expensive cards because, hey, their cheap cards are pretty good in the late game and they don't want to get run over by the aggro decks. So yeah, just to put a button on this cheap card discussion, if you're somebody who likes to draft these rampy, Sultai, grindy decks, and maybe you haven't found a lot of success just yet, don't think that you can't do that. That is definitely a thing you can do in this format. Black-green is one of the better decks in this format. It is a strong strategy. You just need to make sure that, above all else, you're prioritizing those cheap cards, and especially the cheap cards that are still good in the late game, right? That's really what you're looking for. And to give a ballpark number, something like 12. 12 things to do before turn 3 is where I'm happy. I would like a little more, to be honest, but, can't always get those. Second big picture point I want to touch on, and it's something that we did touch on last week, and you might have heard other people talking about this as the format has progressed, but it is the X1 hate, and how, I don't use this term lightly, but I do think format defining is actually pretty appropriate for the situation. So we've got 4 cards here, and there might even be a 5th one I'm forgetting about, but 2 a common here, which are above average commons. Flick a coin, tune a red for an instant, deals a damage to any target, make a treasure, draw a card, and rat out, single black mana, -1/-1 a target creature, and you make a rat token. At uncommon, we've got Frolicking Familiar, which is the 3 mana 2/2 flyer that gets +1/+1 whenever you cast instant and sorcery, and has the red adventure, Blow Off Steam, deals 1 damage to any target. And Shrouded Shepherd. This is the black-white adventure uncommon, 1 white for a 2/2. ETBs give something +2/+2 until end of turn. Cleave Shadows, the adventure, 1 black sorcery. Creatures your opponent control get -1/-1 until end of turn. So I'm calling these X1 hate cards format defining, which sounds a little bit extreme, especially if some of these have not been on your radar as good cards, but I want to try to break this down a little bit. If you're not somebody who looks at 17 land stats, I want to say just straight up that Flick a Coin and Rat Out are some of the top winning commons just straight up in the set. So people are putting these cards in their deck and they're doing well with them. And I don't think people are doing anything in particular that makes these cards better than the average player if they just put this card in their deck. How well would it perform? I don't think people are doing something crazy to make these cards good. I think they're just good cards in the format. The reason they're just good cards in the format is, let's just say you replaced 1 damage with Destroy Target Creature, right? On both Flick a Coin and Rat Out here. Well, if it was 1 mana, Destroy Target Creature, destroy a cheap creature, make a rat, that would be a phenomenal card. Same with Flick a Coin. If you had to pay 3 mana to draw a card, kill a creature, make a treasure, that's an absurd card. They just couldn't print that. Of course, it's not going to be that a lot of the time, but it's going to be that more often than average in this format than it would be in another format, just because there are a lot of 1 toughness creatures, even as you go up to like 3 and 4 mana, right? You get to something like Mocking Sprite in blue, right? This is a 3 mana 2/1 flyer that instant and sorceries cost 1 less to cast, or Stingblade Assassin is another one, 3 and a black for 4 mana here, 3/1 flash flyer that when it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature and opponent control that was dealt damage this turn. Like, when your 2-drop gets gotten by these cards, right? Flick a Coin or Rat Out, you're like, wow, that really sucks. But at least with Flick a Coin, they're trading quote unquote down on mana. They have to pay 3 mana. I guess they get their mana back, which is, a big part of why the card's good. But at least they're not up a mana advantage, right? When they kill a 3-drop or a 4-drop with these cards, that's a game losing play. When your 4-drop gets gotten by a flick or a red out, that might be the key moment where you lost the game. So these are powerful cards and narrow bit powerful, but in this format, their narrowness is diminished because the situations they're going to be good in are, a little bit, come up a little more often just because there are a lot of X1 creatures. And of course, it's not like these cards are dead if you don't have a great target early in the game. You can use Rat Out to win a combat. You can, worst case scenario, with Flick a Coin, you can just send out your opponent's face, right? If you want to cycle it, if they really aren't presenting any targets, or you finish a creature off in combat, maybe a 2/3 attack into a 2/3. You then kill their 2/3. There's so many applications for this card. When you do get to cast these on 1 toughness creature, you feel phenomenal. You instantly skyrocket yourself way ahead in that game. That's such a good exchange. Same thing goes with the Frolicking Familiar and Shrouded Shepherd, right? These are these 1 damage effects, these uncommon adventures that you're not paying a card worth, right? When you get to kill something with Frolicking Familiar and then get a 2/2 flyer, or with Shrouded Shepherd, you get to kill multiple X1s and then have this creature that's, pretty solid creature. That's fantastic. And again, getting to the format defining aspect, I'm calling them format defining because I think if you don't, well, number one, if you don't play these cards, you're going to lose more. And if you don't play around them, you're going to lose more. And I think you really see how good these cards are if you're looking at 17 land stats. Not just that these cards I'm mentioning here, Rat Out, Flick a Coin, Shrouded Shepherd, Frolicking Familiar, are really well performing, right? They're just good cards in the format. But also, you'll see the inverse, where creatures that have 1 toughness, even if they're pretty good creatures, like you read it, it's like, hey, it's not a bad magic card, are doing way, way worse on 17 lands because of the effect of this X1 hate. So, good examples here. Red Tooth Vanguard. This is the 1 and a green 3/1 trample at uncommon. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay 2 and return it to your hand. It is a solid card, right? 2 mana, 3/1 trample that you can buy back later. It's not doing very well, and I do think a big part of this is it's a creature, even just a 2 mana creature, that your opponent gets value on when they kill this with one of the many, many multitudes of excellent effects in the format. Armory Mice, another example. This is the 1 and a white 3/1 that if you have Celebration, it gets +2, so attacks as a 3/3. Well, it's very, very similar to another card in the format, Grand Ball Guest, which is the red version of this, basically. 2 mana for a 2/2, though if you have Celebration, it gets +1/+1 and Trample. And this one's doing way, 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 way worse in the data. And of course, white is a different color than red, but really similar looking cards functionally looking to do the same thing, but because Mice has 1 toughness, it's performing way, way worse. So for a little bit of a look behind not just how I prepare for this podcast and give you information that I think is going to be helpful, but also how I tend to learn formats, or just a tool that helps me learn formats, is I go on 17 lands and I'm looking for trends among cards, similar classes of cards that, maybe counterspells are doing well in a particular format. I'll say, counterspells happen to be pretty good in this format for XYZ reasons. You can kind of reverse engineer why they might be good. That tells you a bit more about a story of the format. Maybe that happens to mean that the expensive cards are really good. Maybe that happens to mean that blue tempo strategies are strong. But whenever you can find a class of cards that are performing similar, like cards that do similar things or have similar attributes, those can clue you in, point you into the right direction of kinds of cards you want to play, and more importantly, I think, the kinds of cards you don't want to play. And this is all done with the idea of trying to find like a truth about the format, something you can broadly apply. You might even frame it as a heuristic, something that you can generally say about the format. A good example, Lord of the Rings. After looking at the data on the State of the Format episode, I said, hey, all these tempting cards, all the cards that tempt you, even the ones that look kind of dorky and not as good, are doing a lot better than you might expect. And a truth I think we came to know about that format is tempting is really strong, and the more tempt cards you can get into your deck, the better your deck's going to be. An example of finding a group of cards or a thread between cards that made me not want to put certain cards in my deck was for March of the Machine. If you were listening to the podcast for March of the Machine, you'll know I went on my whole spiel about how the 4 and 5 mana cards in that format had to have an enter the battlefield or death trigger because the removal in that format was just really, really strong. And if your 4 mana creature that had no enter the battlefield effect died to a 2 mana removal spell, you were going to start losing the game if it happened over and over, right? If they just kept getting a mana advantage. And the way I got to that was there was a bunch of rares in that set that were they fell into that camp. 4 and 5 mana things that, they looked pretty strong if they stuck around, if they did, you happen to untap with them. But they just were performing terribly. Like a good example is Heliod. It's like the 4 mana 4/4 that you can pay. I think it's like 5 mana to transform it. And the backside makes it a little bit bigger and lets you cast your spells as though they had flash. Okay, so not a over-the-top, amazing, fantastic card, but 4 mana 4/4 with a relevant ability, I'll say. And that card was winning at like 50% or something, like 50% game-in-hand win rate, which is like 5% lower than an average common in that format. And part of that could be that it's a rare and people take it a little bit earlier than they should, but that shouldn't affect it that much. So really there was something else at play, something else going on. And I realized that same pattern I noticed, 4 mana and above card that looked pretty good, but actually wasn't doing that well, that panned out over other rares. And in this set, in Wilds of Eldraine, that thing, that thread, is 1 toughness. So good rares here, cards that look like good rares, but are performing at that, like, maybe not 50%, but one of these cards is like 51%, and one of these cards is, kind of just below average. Sir Ginger here is the first one I'm going to talk about, performing just below average. It says 2 mana, artifact creature, 3/1. It gets a counter anytime an artifact enters the battlefield, which could be a food, and you scry 1. And then it has another ability, 2 tap sack, you gain life equal to Sir Ginger's power. Totally fine card, right? Like, this is not a bad card. This is not a card I would expect to underperform. It's not super exciting over the top, but it's a solid card. And it's performing below average. And then Likeness Looter is the other one I want to talk about here. Black, blue for a 1/1 flyer. Tap, draw a card, then discard a card, and then you can also pay X to make it a copy of something in your graveyard, where X is that creature you copy's mana value. This card is, like, winning at 51% last time I checked. And that's really surprising for a card that looks pretty good. Just 2 mana looter, flying, can become bigger in the late game, but it's got 1 toughness and has no enter the battlefield or death trigger, and that's making it perform much worse than it normally would. At least that's my theory, right? That's my hypothesis. I can't say for sure, but you'll see this trend on a lot of the 1 toughness creatures. And I want to also say that if your creature has a death trigger or an enter the battlefield effect, that's okay. Or if it costs 1 mana, right? Because 1 mana, you can only go so wrong with 1 mana, right? If they rat out your Ginger Brute, okay, sure. But, what can you do about it? When you start to get to like the 2 and the 3 mana cards, that's where you really start to be a bit picky about them, or I really start to be picky. And you might put these cards in your deck and not realize you're losing because of this dynamic, right? So something like Minstrosity, actually, would be a good example of a card I'm still happy to play. This is the 2 mana, 1 and a black, 3/1. When it dies, you make a food. Because if they kill your thing, if they rat it out, they flick a coin, you still get a food. That's okay. You still get some value. You just don't want to be left high and dry where they get to cast their value-generating removal spell against your non-value-generating creature. That's a bad place to be. So how does this translate into something that you can actually use and actually start winning more with? Well, number one, just know that having 1 toughness is an inherent downside in this format. Just know that is something that when you're evaluating cards in a pack and you're going, hey, this looks pretty strong, just look at that toughness box. If it's 1 and doesn't grant value on death or entering, or have an adventure maybe is another thing I could say that makes up for that fact, it's just going to be a little bit, or maybe a lot worse than you might think. And this matters for gameplay too, right? Just knowing your opponent, your black or red opponent could have 2 or 3 copies of Flick a Coin or Rat Out. By the way, just to touch on some numbers here, I have been playing 2 flicks pretty happily. The third one gets a little bit clunky. Same with Rat Out. I've been playing 2 quite happily. I think I might play, a combination of 3, those 2 in tandem, like 3 copies, 4 at my max. And that sounds like a lot to some people potentially if you haven't been playing with these cards or playing against them. And I think right now in Arena, the lower tiers, people in, gold and silver and platinum, probably aren't going to experience the effect of this X1 hate as much, because I think people in those lower tiers are not taking Flick a Coin, Rat Out very highly. Me playing in Mythic all the time, I'm facing that, game in, game out. It's very, very, very common for my opponent to have one of these kind of cards in their opening hand. And even still, if you are a lower rank, I would expect in the next few weeks, people are going to catch on and you're going to face this stuff. So it's going to be very important that you have it in your head when you're playing. On your turn, your opponent has 1 black mana open. Do you attack your 3/3 into their 3/3? Maybe you do, but maybe you take pause and be like, well, if they have a Rat Out here, it's really, really bad for me, so I should play around that. A specific example I want to call out is Ratcatcher Trainee. This is the 2 mana, 2/1 first strike on your turn, has the Pest Problem Adventure where you make 2 rats. I started out the format just thinking, okay, you always round this out on 2 if you have nothing else to do, and you draw it later, you can cast Pest Problem, cool. And I've actually been leaning away from that and really trying my best not to cast Ratcatcher Trainee on turn 2 to not get gotten by these 1 toughness effects. If you can, I would really highly recommend just holding this, casting Pest Problem instead, so that they don't get full value on their card. If it's your only thing to do on 2 mana, maybe you just do it, right? But if you're not a particularly aggressive deck, or your opponent's not pressuring you, maybe you can feel like you can afford not to spend the 2 mana, your opponent passes the turn on turn 2, maybe just hold it, right? I'm not saying it's going to be right every single game. I'm just saying it's something you should consider. And especially in those times when it's like, well, it's a turn 4. I could double spell with a 2-drop in my trainee, or I could just hold this for next turn. That's where, as the game's already kind of gone on, I will really try to hold it and get full value out of it. And what kind of got me curious about this idea was I was looking at some in-depth stats on 17 lands for Ratcatcher Trainee. And I was looking specifically at its game drawn win rate compared to its opening hand win rate. Opening hand win rate, of course, is just, was this card in my opening hand? If so, how often did a player win with it? Game drawn being the opposite of that. And there is a substantial difference between the opening hand win rate and the game drawn win rate. The opening hand win rate was like 3 points lower than the game drawn win rate, which says to me that Ratcatcher Trainee is better in the late game than it is on turn 2. Now, how much of that is because of the X1 hate, or how much of that is it's just very, very good to get rats? I'm not exactly sure, but I do think it's a possibility that I'm willing to entertain, that it's so important to keep your opponent from effectively using their X1 hate cards that you shouldn't play this out on turn 2, even if you have nothing else to do. I'm not saying that's 100% correct. I'm just willing to entertain the idea. Just some food for thought, basically. I would still recommend right now, if I'm to give a recommendation, play your training on turn 2, but if you have anything else to do try to hold it until you can get that adventure, I would say. All right, so a little bit of a long-winded intro section, but I do think it's really important to internalize those concepts, not just for your own understanding of the format, but as we now move into talking about the colors, talking about the cards I like from each color, I think it'll really help frame things a little bit more. And this section, talking about the top cards in each color, it's going to be a little bit more bing, bang, boom, just being like, hey, this card's good or this card's not so good. Less theory to unpack. Let us start by talking about the stronger colors and the not so strong colors in this format. There's been some talk about, is this a Jund format? Is it an Obzon format? A Mardu format? And I had it as a Jund format for the first week of the format, where the red, black, and green cards were so much better than the white and the blue ones. My take on the format has evolved a little bit since then, a little bit more nuanced. I think that red and black are clearly the best colors. Like, I think that they're really deep, a lot of really good cards at common. Right now on Arena, red is actually pretty underdrafted. It seems that the average Arena drafter does not like the red cards for whatever reason, and I'm going to touch on some of the ones I think are kind of underrated. Black, of course, as it often is, people like their black removal spells. People, identify those pretty easily as good cards in packs. Black cards are getting drafted where they should, although I'm still happy to be in it because the list of commons that I'm happy with in my deck is quite long. There's like 10 commons. I'm like, hey, that's a perfectly fine black common to put in my deck. I'm not shying away from it because it's overdrafted. So if I can start off my draft in one of these tier 1 colors, I will. They're great bases for decks in the format. I love base red decks and I love base black decks. Then you get to what I consider the tier 2 colors, and these are still colors I like being in. They're just not as deep as either red or black. We've got white and green, and I've come down a little bit on the green cards, or on green as a color, just because I do feel like what green offers is Hamlet Glutton at common, a plethora of interchangeable fixing, which, it's good to pick up, but it's not like going to be the core of your deck, and the uncommons. The uncommons are really strong in green. Probably the color with the best uncommons. You've got Welcome to Sweet Tooth and Tough Cookie, Agatha's Champion, just all these A-level uncommons that are just excellent. So if you can get those, great. But as people have realized that green is one of the better colors, you don't get the Gluttons as often. That's a highly picked card now, or it wasn't the first few days of the format. People now know that the kind of unassuming Tough Cookie and Welcome to Sweet Tooth are good. So I'm happy when I can get into it. I'm just a little bit less likely to start there because I think that the important cards for green, people know they're good and they go quite early now. White is an interesting one. White I didn't like very much at the beginning of the format. As I played it now, a little bit more, I really like how it pairs with red because I think red-white aggro is one of the best, if not the best decks in the format. It also is kind of the inverse of green, where I think green actually has better cards, for sure. Greens, I think it would be hard to argue that green's cards, if you just pound for pound, put them next to white cards, green cards are better. But white, unlike green, where green's a little bit overdrafted at this point, or at least it's picking up steam, people are drafting it, there is a package of 4 white commons that we're going to get to that I think are pretty underdrafted, and or at least some of them, and I'm really happy with that common core. So you're drafting green for the uncommons, drafting right for the commons is really what it comes down to. And then we get to blue. Blue is an interesting one. I would describe blue as a puzzle to be solved. I think there's something there. I think I would not recommend not putting islands in your deck in this format, right? There are some formats where the worst color is so bad that you just should try to avoid it. I don't think we're quite there, but I also think that it's a color that it's not incredibly obvious how you should be drafting it. I'll point you towards Sam Black's most recent podcast. He had a podcast about how to draft blue-white, not as a tapping deck, but as a bargain deck. He talks about some concepts there that I'm going to kind of dance around when I talk about blue as a color. But really, what it comes down to is that blue is winning less than the other colors, full stop. Like, there's no argument about that. There is an argument to be had about, is it a color that people are just drafting wrong, or are they prioritizing the wrong cards? I think there is definitely some of that happening, because if you look at how blue is performing amongst top players, it's actually performing about as well as the other colors. So that's why I say it's a bit of a puzzle, a bit of something to uncover. We'll dive into it when we get to it, but I just want to note that it is perceived, and I would still call it the worst color in the format right now. So let's start with red. Red is my favorite color in the format. I don't claim for it to be better than black necessarily, but it's the color that I've been drafting the most because, like I mentioned, it is a little bit underdrafted, and it also plays into my proclivities a little bit as a Magic player. So cards that I like in red. There's this package of 4 what I would consider to be premium or almost premium commons. Torch the Tower, single mana, deal 2, bargain it, deals 3. Cut In is one that I really want to mention, as this is one of the underdrafted cards. People seem not to like this card very much on Arena. It says 3 in a red for a sorcery. Cut In deals 4 damage to target creature. And then you make a young hero role token attached to one of the creatures you control. Card is a beating. When you play this on turn 4 after you've gone 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, or even just 2-drop, 3-drop, kill their best thing. Now your small thing gets to attack because you put the hero role token on it, where you might have not have been able to have an attack before. And then if that gets in for 1 turn, it's likely to get in again because it's going to keep growing again because it's the hero role. Card leads to a lot of game states where your opponent feels like, all right, I'm like just on the back foot here, and then your opponent casts Cut In and it's just over, right? So I would definitely play multiple copies of this card. Don't look at it as like, ooh, 4 mana, sorcery speed, deal 4. That's a little bit clunky. It is that, but the young hero role really elevates it to something better. Other 2 cards we've talked about quite a bit today, Flick a Coin and Ratcatcher Trainee. Gonna really, these are the 4 ones I'm really looking for. But then when you go a little bit deeper, you don't get 2 cards that are much worse. You get Harried Spearguard, 1 mana, 1/1 haste, and when it dies, you make a rat token. Really strong card in any deck looking to attack early. Your red-black decks, your white-red decks, very happy to include multiple copies of this card. Edgewell Pack is another one that is, I think, pretty underrated, just considering how late it goes. This is the 4 mana, 3/3, 3 in a red for a menace creature that comes in with a rat friend, just a strong aggro card in general. Grabby Giant. Here's one that I've been pretty impressed with. This is the 4 mana 4/3 Reach that has the ability 2 in a red to sack a land or an artifact to draw a card. Also has the adventure That's Mine, 1 in a red for an instant, make a treasure token. So this is just a card that, it's good when you cast it. You don't always cast the adventure side, but this is actually, Grabby Giant's a card that I had in mind when I was talking about the trainee, when I was saying, well, if you've got something to do on turn 2 that's not the Ratcatcher Trainee, if you can help it, maybe you lean towards that. Like, I have multiple times cast That's Mine in my red deck instead of casting Ratcatcher Trainee, which usually the play pattern would just be, just play your attacking creature, right? That's the kind of thing where I think you can definitely argue, given the context of your hand, that you should do. Anyways, I like Grabby Giant. It's just a solid card. And then Redcap Thief. Redcap Thief is one that I like more than most people. It seems, not just on Arena, but even in my Twitch chat. I've been talking this card up, and some people have said they've been unhappy to play this card. So this is the 3 mana, 2 in a red for a 2/3 ETBs, makes a treasure. I don't think this is a premium card by any means, but it's a solid one. I'm happy to have this in my deck. It triggers Celebration, gives you a treasure which you can use for various reasons, either ramping to 5 mana or sacking a bargain. It fixes you. So I just have not been too sad about having this card in my deck. And then one comment that I do want to call out that I was low on and had come up as I played more and more is Gnawing Crescendos. This is 2 in a red for an instant. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. Then whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you make a rat token. I don't think this is as good as the other cards I just talked about, but it's definitely a solid card in the right deck. Obviously, the more rat making, the more creatures you have that generate multiple bodies, the more you want this card. but I would be careful about what kind of red deck you put it in. Because a red-green aggro-ish deck where your game plan is really like play a 2-drop, play a 3-drop, play a 4-drop, then leverage those with combat tricks, get my well-statted creatures in, attack, maybe have some larger creatures that my opponent can't block profitably. That's not the kind of deck you want 9 Crescendo in. Because what's going to happen in that deck is you're going to attack with a few things. They're going to go like, okay, make some blocks, and the creatures are all just going to trade. You're not going that wide because you only played 1 creature per turn, and you're not pushing damage, and it's like, okay, you got left with some rats, but it's not that effective, really, right? Where you really want this is in, like, your red-white or your black-red aggro decks, where the game plan is much more, play a bunch of 1-drops, play a bunch of 2-drops, dump my hand as quick as possible. Where I want non-crescendo is where I'm going, like, Gingerbrute into Harried Spearmaster X2 on turn 2. You got, like, 3 hasty creatures in play. Turn 3, maybe you even play, like, a 2-drop and another 1-drop. And then your finisher is non-crescendo, right? That's where it's really effective because you've just dumped your hand. Your opponent's not going to get on board as early as you have. And you're actually going to push a bunch of damage and make a bunch of rats. So, real distinction to be made there between the 2 types of aggro decks. One that has a bunch of 1s. Like, if you think you can double spell with 1-drops on turn 2 sometimes, that's when you should play non-crescendo. You shouldn't play it if it's like, I got some 1s, that I might play sometimes. I'm not as into it as that. It has to be a consistent thing for non-crescendo to be a card I want. Moving on to some red uncommons, and I am going to touch on some uncommons as we go through the colors here. Not every single uncommon that I like, but I want to point out ones that I think are underrated or overrated. Starting off here, we've got 2 active treason variants. Twisted Fealty is a 2 red uncommon, gain control of target creature, untap, gain haste, but you also make a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature. Other card here, it's kind of similar, Ariad's Tempting Apple, 4 mana, it's a food, comes in, steals something till end of turn, but it's got 2 abilities, tap sack, gain 3, like any food, or tap sack, your opponent loses 2 life. So there's 2 things going on that make these better than your typical active treason, and surprisingly, it's not that you can steal your opponent's creature and then sacrifice it. That can happen from time to time. There are 1 or 2 things that sacrifice creatures in this set. Not a lot, actually, lower than most sets with these effects. Usually they like to pair, a sacrifice archetype with these effects. There's not that many things that sacrifice creatures in this set. There's Bargain, of course, which is a sacrifice outlet, but only for tokens, and you often don't want to steal your opponent's, rat token. You want to steal their big, dumb green thing and attack them with it, right? So, the 2 things that do make these cards a little bit better than your average card that look like that, well, number 1, they give you a little bit more than your average active treason. They are responsible for a little more damage. Often, you steal their best thing, you attack, maybe they chump block with it. But with Fealty, you also get that Wicked Roll token. So now another creature is attacking a little bit better. And the Wicked Roll token falls off at some point, they deal a point of damage. Tempting Apple, same kind of thing, where, maybe the active treason effect's not going to get them, but that 3 damage, that makes it a much stronger card. The other factor here, is that unlike most active treason effects, where really, you don't want to cast them anytime aside from the last spell you cast, right? Active treasons they're powerful, but they're narrow. You want to steal, just as your opponent's stabilizing, you've curved out with your aggro creatures, they're about to stabilize, you cast one of these cards, you steal their best thing, you attack them, they die. Okay, well, that's a narrow situation, that's only going to be at the end of the game. Both of these cards, I don't mind casting before the end of the game, or even on curve sometimes. So, I would prefer to cast a 3-drop to 4-drop, but if these are my only 3 mana, 4 mana cards in hand, I really don't mind just going, 2-drop, turn 3, maybe my opponent was even on the play and they got to play their 3-drop before me. I go 2-drop, Twisted Fealty, steal your creature, put a Wicked Roll in my 2-drop, attack you for 6, that's a big chunk of damage, now my 2-drop is a relevant threat that you have to deal with. Again, this is not going to be something you're going to do every single game, I would prefer to play a creature, but that buyout clause of a card that you're usually only happy to cast as the last spell of the game being okay on curve means that it's a much stronger card. Tempting Apple, same thing, right? You can cast it early, just have it sit there, maybe, the game's going on a little longer, you actually do gain 3 instead of making them lose 3 because, it's a bit of a race, or, you sack this to Bargain at some point, same with the Wicked Roll token, so a lot more flexibility, and also just a more powerful card than your average steal your creature for a turn card tends to be. And then another one here that I think is pretty underrated is Monstrous Rage, single red mana instant, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn, you make a Monstrous Roll token attached to it, which of course means it gets +3/+1 in trample, and that +1/+1 sticks around. just a fantastic combat trick, right? Don't look at this as a lesser card just because it is a combat trick. It's a really, really, really pushed combat trick, and you should take it highly. On to black now, and just like red, like I mentioned, black is very deep, so we're gonna have a laundry list of cards I like here. Number one, I think pretty clearly is Candy Grapple. 2 mana, -3/-3. If you bargain it, -5 instead. Card is just great. Play a bunch of copies, take it early. One that might surprise some people is Hopeless Nightmare. So this is the single black mana enchantment. Enters the battlefield, your opponent loses 2 life, and they discard a card. You can also pay 2 and a white to sacrifice the Nightmare, and whenever the Nightmare gets put into the graveyard, you scry 2, so that could be to scrying, or it could be to bargaining it away somehow. This card is just a good card. I think it looks like it's like a bargain, kind of weird bargain enabler. It does enable your bargain quite nicely, but the way you want to kind of frame this card is, it's 1 mana, we both discard a card. So we're basically on parity, right? I discard my worst card, you discard your worst card. My worst card being Hopeless Nightmare. I've spent 1 mana, which isn't nothing, but, you know, it's just 1 mana. And so we're kind of same pace here, right? But you also deal your opponent 2 damage, so that's another little thing for your 1 mana. And scrying 2, as we know, as the game goes on, becomes close to a card at some point when you want to, scry away those lands. So all of that added together means that you should just be happy playing multiple copies of this card. Like, I think with no bargain in your deck, I would play 2 to 3 copies pretty happily. Now, that's, making sure your creature count's high enough. I don't want this to eat into my creature count, but this is just a fine card to play, right? You can just play this, put in your deck, and it will be good. Rat Out, like I mentioned, another card that I do prioritize fairly highly. I think you should too. And Sweet Tooth Witch as kind of the last of the generically awesome black commons here. This one's 2 and a black, 3 mana for a 3/2. ETBs make a food, and you can pay 2 to sack the food, or sack any food, to deal 2 damage to your opponent. And this card has just been good. Like, it's kind of the same thing. You might think it's a food card, but it is a good food card, but it's also just good as a 3 mana thing that makes a food. 3 mana, make 2 rectangles that you can sacrifice, etc., etc. And then you get a little bit deeper to the cards that I like, but not quite as much. Minstrosity, good 2-drop, 2 mana, 3/1. When it dies, you make a food. Feed the Cauldron, 3 mana, destroy target creature, mana value 3 or less. If it's your turn, you make a food. Then you get to 2 3-drops here, which I like about equally, but maybe in different decks. Conceited Witch, which is the 3 mana, 2/3 menace that has the adventure sorcery to put a Wicked Roll token on something you control, and Voracious Vermin, which is the 3 mana, 2/1 that comes along with a rat friend, and then whenever something dies, you put a counter on the vermin. I've deprioritized these a little bit in my draft because there's a lot of good 3 mana cards in the set, a lot of good 3-drops in general in black, but just amongst all the colors, a lot of strong 3-drops, so I end up with a lot of them. I don't mind these cards. I think they're totally serviceable, CC plus level cards. I just don't take them that highly anymore. I will take something like Minstrosity over them quite often, just because a 2 mana card is better than a 3 mana card a lot of the time in this format, and there's a relative bottleneck on the number of 2 and 1-drops you can get in your deck. I would like as many of those as I can, so you just want to prioritize the cheaper cards a little bit higher. And then speaking of cheaper cards, Barrow Noddy, I want to call this one out. This is 1 in a black for a 1/3 fairy with flying that has lifelink as long as you control another fairy, and it has 2 in a black to give it +1/+0. I found this card to be perfectly serviceable. I mean, it gets better if you have other fairies in your deck, obviously, quite a bit better, but even just, a package of like 3 of these on its own as your 2-drops in your black decks without any other fairies, I found to be pretty good. Because when these start to lifelink, it's a really tough card for your opponent to beat. Just any opponent, as a control player, you've got this evasive threat. As facing an aggro deck, the aggro deck doesn't like to see lifelink. And it's also just, like I just said, 2-drops are at a premium. A 1/3 flying body is just not that bad. So just a solid card to put in your deck. I wouldn't mind it as my 23rd card if I had literally no fairies, but you do want to try to add a few fairies if you can. And then just a quick note on Shadow to the Oath, which is the 3 black sorcery speed removal spell. Destroy target creature or enchantment, and you make a Wicked Roll token attached to 1 target creature you control. Got a lot of questions, comments on why I don't take this card very highly. And honestly, at this point, I was actually a little bit surprised that I got that question. I think this card, at least I think if you've been playing Limited for the past little while, does not look that good. This is the kind of card 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. 5 mana, kill anything with a little bit of upside would have been pretty good. It's just a 5 mana removal spell. It kills anything, but you just don't need to prioritize that highly. I'll play a copy if I pick one up, but I'm not ever taking this highly. I'm never going, ooh, Shatter is a removal spell. It's fine, but I'm not that happy to play multiple copies. I would only really want to play 1, I guess is the way to put it. So that's black and red. Those are the tier 1 colors in my mind. And just some thoughts on how you want to play the colors a little bit. Or at least what decks you're looking to get into if you start red or black. Well, that's kind of the beauty of it, right? Like, I like red's pairing with pretty much every color, even blue and black. Same thing. Like, I think if I'm going to pair blue with a color, I would like it to be red or black, the two deepest colors that I think actually complement blue and what it's doing pretty well. Like I said, I really like white red. So the nice thing I think about drafting these colors is there's no particular way you need to play your cards. Like, the black cards are just good in the black decks. Sure, some of them care a little more about food. Maybe some of them care a little bit more about being enchanted with roll tokens. But across all of the red or black cards, you won't really be making a mistake if you just take the good ones I mentioned and put them in your deck. Now we get to the tier 2 of colors here, green and white, starting with green. And green's got two things kind of going on. One, it's really good at supporting the rampy splish splashing plan, but there are other decks where I'm just like, a red-green aggro deck where I want some more generically good cards. I don't really want the rampy cards, and I've got 3 commons here that I have been happy to put in basically any green deck. They are, number 1, Hamlet Glutton. This is the 7 mana, 5 GG, 6/6, costs 2 less if it was bargained. Trample, you gain 3 life. Just a fantastic card. Really, I think the best version of this effect we've ever had. You do want to make sure you've got enough cheap things you can bargain away so that you're not stuck with 7 drops in hand. But whenever your opponent casts on turn 5, you just feel like you really are behind. If it's often the biggest thing on the board. I haven't had it not be the biggest thing on the board for me yet. Gaining 3 life means it's a big stabilizing tool versus aggro. So that's the head honcho here. And then one that honestly is not that much below it, I think is pretty underrated, is Hollow Scavenger. So this is 3 and a green for a adventure creature, 3/2, that you can pay 1 to sack a food, and the scavenger gets +2/+2 until end of turn. You can only do that once per turn. And it's got Bakery Raid as its adventure. Single green, sorcery, you make a food token. So the way that this plays out is you play the food token on turn 1, you have it for pumping the scavenger on turn 4+, and it's a pretty big threat of activation thing. Like, your opponent doesn't want to block with their 3/4 on your Hollow Scavenger, because pay a mana and sack the food and you win the combat. Pretty good blocker too. 4 toughness on blocks as long as you've got a mana, and it's just a good value creature, really. Like, even just like 3/2, sort of like the Sweet Tooth Witch. 3 mana 3/2 comes with the food. You're paying 4, but it's in installments. So just a really solid plan. Not only is it synergistic, but it's good on rate, right? And that's what you're really looking for your top commons of any color. Am I just happy to put this in any deck? Another one, Ferocious Werefox. This one I actually took a while for me to come around to, but I'm starting to really like this one. This is 3 and a green for a 4/3 trample. It's got the adventure side, guard change. So this is 2 and a green instant, create a monster roll token attached to a creature you control. I've liked this card in my slower decks even, just to make my 2-drop a little bit beefier, make it block a little better, and then have this 4/3 I can cast later. I've liked it in my aggro decks as, it's a good combat trick attached to a good aggressive creature. So basically anywhere is where this card I think fits well. Probably ever so slightly better in the decks that have a really high creature count, the aggro decks, where you're consistently going to be able to not only have a creature to target with the guard change, but pressure your opponent into blocking, so the guard change is more effective. But yeah, it's a card I'm just happy with anywhere. Next one here is sort of interesting. It's Redtooth Genealogist. This is the 3 mana 2/3 in green that when it enters, you get a royal roll token attached to target creature you control. Sorry, specifically another target creature you control. A card I was really high on to start with. I've come down a little bit on it, mostly because in about half of my green decks, like the rampy ones, you don't have a density of cheap creatures to play. A lot of your early turns in those ramp decks are playing your Brave the Wilds, maybe casting an interaction spell, maybe a Saga or something, where you don't immediately have a target for the Genealogist. I want to be playing Genealogist in like a red-green beatdown deck, or maybe white-green, which is a deck that I don't think is actually very popular, not a deck that a lot of people draft, but strategically that's where I would want to be, in a deck that cares about rolls, really has a high density of 2-drops, so that when you cast this card, it's not a 3 mana 2/3. You really want to avoid that. You really want to not have a 3 mana 2/3 in your deck. You want this to be, come along, actually adding a roll. So a powerful card, a good card, but one that it requires a bit of a deck building cost. So a powerful card, a good card, just one that you have to be careful what deck you're putting it in. 2 cards that I would consider a trap at this point. When I say a trap, I don't mean it's a terrible card that you should never play. A trap as in people seem to be valuing this card substantially higher than where I actually think they should. So first one here is Beanstalk Worm. This is 5 mana, 4 and a green for a 5/4 reach. It's got Plant Beans as a sorcery adventure, 1 and a green. You can play an additional land this turn. This card is passable. Like, it's okay, but I don't even, like, I'm hesitating to even say it's passable. I think this card is below rate. I think you should not try to play this card. It is a card I have put in my deck where I just, like, had a bunch of ramp, but then had no top end, and I was unhappy with it. The appealing part of this card, I think the part that looks appealing, is this plant beans side, because you're like, oh, great. I got a ramp spell attached to my big creature. That's a nice little, 1-2 punch. But the plant bean sorcery is a lot less effective than you might think it is, because unless you have a really land heavy hand, it doesn't ramp you meaningfully. What I mean is, if you're just going to be playing that additional land that you would have played, the turn you cast plant beans, you just play it next turn instead. Well, it's the same thing basically as not casting plant beans, but you haven't spent 2 mana. So you have to be a really, really land heavy hand. You got 5-6 lands in your hand for that additional land to actually be something, right? You're not generating a resource. This isn't a ramp spell. You're just putting that resource onto the battlefield a bit earlier than you normally would be able to. So I don't want to say never play this card, but this isn't an appealing card. You shouldn't look to put this card in your deck. Another one here, Curse of the Werefox. This is the fight spell. 2 and a green for a sorcery. Make a monster roll token attached to target creature you control. That creature then fights something. Just like most fight spells, I think, tend to be a little bit overvalued by the general arena drafting population. I think people see these cards and liken them to their red and black cohorts, where it's just like, all right, Torch the Tower, Grapple, great cards. The green fight spells, especially sorcery speed ones, tend to be a little bit worse. Not only do these get blown up by removal spells, but being a fight, not a bite, means it gets blown up by a combat trick as well. So again, not a card I'm that sad about, but both of these cards, they're at Elsas, which is where they're taken on average, according to 17 lands. People are drafting these cards really highly. I think these should be more cards that, like, in the case of the Worm, a card you wheel. In the case of the Werefox, a card you're okay picking up if you're in green, but it's not really a priority. 2 cards that I will advocate for combat tricks here: Leaping Ambush and Titanic Growth. So Leaping Ambush, single mana for an instant. Target creature gets +1/+3 and gains reach until end of turn. Untap it. These kind of cards, these pretty substantial toughness boost, little bit of a power boost, untap, interacts with flyers, either giving the creature flying or reach, 1 mana, all are kind of a recipe for a good combat trick. These cards tend to overperform. We had Escape from Orthanc as the white version of this that gave flying last set, and that one actually wasn't one of the better times we've seen this that kind of effect. It had some contextual factors that made it not as good in the format, but this card is good. Like, it's just a good effect, a solid combat trick. Even in your slower decks, the thing that really, I think, makes this card over the top and better than your average combat trick is, number 1, it's 1 mana, but number 2, it's really difficult for your opponent to play around this. Not that a lot of opponents are going to, because it's not a very popular card. It's not a card that gets played that often, but the idea is, okay, you attack in, use your combat trick, win the combat. Now you have this untapped creature. Your opponent's attack step's going to be a little bit worse. But also, when your opponent attacks into you, you can make this a 1 mana kill your thing, right? Untap your biggest thing, eat their thing, especially if that thing has flying. Leaping Ambush does give reach. And of course, there's the issue of, well, I'm casting my combat trick into open mana on your opponent's turn at that point. The thing is, in this set, especially against aggressive opponents that have celebration cards in their deck, they're going to be tapping out on their main phase 1 before combat a lot of the time. So you really don't mind, you're not going to be playing this into open mana that often. And, you're not going to do it when their opponent has 4 mana, but there's a lot of situations where your opponent's got 1 mana and you're like, all right, I feel pretty safe casting this, eating my opponent's attacker, and that's a good deal. Titanic Growth is another one that I'm a little bit lower on, but it's still a card I think I'm higher on than most people. This is 1 in a green, +4/+4. 4 is a big number. 4 is a really big number. You win basically every combat you get into with this card. It's good in your red-green stompy aggro decks, good with trample. I'm less happy to play this than Leaping Ambush in kind of my slower decks, just because this is more of an aggressive card. You don't get that untap, but it is a card that I think it is a little bit underplayed right now. I was going to talk about some underrated green commons, but by the time I actually got this, around to recording this podcast, I think people now know these cards are really, really strong, about as good as the good rares in the set. Tough Cookie and Welcome to Sweet Tooth. These cards are great. I'm not going to go over them too much because I think most people see these in packs and take them pretty early now. But if you're somebody who has not taken these cards, they are very, very strong. Any of these cheap cards that are cheap creatures, or a Saga in the case of Welcome to Sweet Tooth that makes multiple permanents, just good. Just spits out a bunch of permanents. Going to be a card that you want in basically any deck. But one card that I do think is underrated, and I should call out here, is Utopia Sprawl. So single green mana for an aura, it enchants a forest. When it enters, you choose a color, and whenever you tap that land, you make that color as well as whatever, the forest mana, which is going to be green. People ask me, hey, why is this card good? Why are you taking it as highly as you are? The answer is pretty simple. It's that 1 mana acceleration is really busted. They don't print these kind of cards in Standard. Like, you don't print Land Over Elves in Standard. You don't have Utopia Sprawl style cards in Standard. Just playing, I was talking about how many good 3-drops are in this set. Playing your 3-drop on turn 2 and then your 4-drop on turn 3. I don't have to spell it out too much. But these kind of cards are rarities. You don't usually get 1 mana versions of this, especially a version that doesn't die to a removal spell like Land Over Elf might. And on top of that, also fixes you, adds mana of any color, helps when you're splashing. So really one of the premium green uncommons. You should be taking this highly. This is the best fixing option you have in green. All right, that's going to bring us to white, and white's going to be a bit quicker than the other colors. It doesn't have a lot of cards I like, but the cards that it does have that I like are quite strong, and like I mentioned before, a little bit underrated. So the number 1 white common, Hopeful Vigil, 2 mana, enchantment. When it ETBs, you make a night token. It's got the same text as Hopeless Nightmare, where you can sack it for 3 mana, or you can, whenever it's put into the battlefield, you scry 2, and it's a good thing to bargain away. This is the linchpin of a lot of my white decks. Not only is it great bargain fodder, but it plays extremely well with Stockpiling Celebrant, which is another one of the white commons I like here. The 3 mana 3/2 that when ETBs, you can pick up a permanent if you scry 2. Celebrant plays really well with a lot of cards, honestly, like Hopeful Vigil, picks up your creatures that have been cooped up, picks up your Prophetic Prisms. There's a lot of little things you can do with this card, and really, it's here in this top 4 common pile just to pair with Hopeful Vigil, but it's not the only thing that it does in this set. There's a lot of really cool things that Celebrant does, and it's just a quality card. The other two, one that's kind of an obvious one, Cooped Up, 2 mana, Pacifism variant that you can pay 3 to exile Enchanted Creature. Not a huge fan of Pacifism in general, but when you can get the thing off the battlefield, it upgrades it quite a bit. And Archon's Glory. I really do want to highlight Archon's Glory as a premium white card here. Single white mana for an instant with Bargain, +2/+2, and if it was bargained, the creature gets lifelink and flying as well. Just a card that is good in the early game and will win a lot of races, will send you over the top in your red-white aggro decks. Even in your slower decks, you really don't mind it. And the thing to really conceptualize about some of the bargain cards is that it's an advantage to bargain away stuff at some point, right? Hopeful Vigil. Good point, or a good example. Bargain away just a permanent you don't need, or a permanent that has a negative effect. There's, for example, we've got Princess Takes Flight, which is the white saga at an uncommon that you really want to get rid of so you can exile your opponent's creature for good. It's got a lot of small synergies, and it's just a good rate trick. So this package of 4 white commons, this is what draws me in, and there's also a lot of good white rares, which it really helps, right? We talked about this in the set review, me and my set review partner, Mark, but it's great when a weaker color gets good rares, so that you are incentivized to draft that once in a while. You're not just going to be like, oh, well, he doesn't have any good commons. Well, you're going to start with a good rare once in a while, and you're looking for these 4 commons to pick up. A card I want to shout out here that is not very good, and, some experienced players, I think, are going to know this, and some unexperienced players are maybe going to be a little bit surprised that this kind of card is not good, but Stroke of Midnight. This is 2 and a white for an instant. Destroy target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 1/1 human token. The thing about this is that it's a removal spell that gives your opponent something. And these are honestly never good. There's very few exceptions I can remember of a removal spell that gave your opponent a benefit that was a good card. I guess Swords to Plowshares. Swords to Plowshares is so efficient that, you don't mind. But even then, you're giving them life, not a tangible permanent, right? Giving them a 1/1 might not seem that much, but they can bargain away that 1/1. They can block, they can attack with it, they can, equip it, enchant it. That 1/1's a real card, right? And yes, when you downgrade your opponent's 6/6 into a 1/1, you're gonna be like, great. But what happens when it's a 3/3? You're not gonna want to downgrade their 3/3 into a 1/1. That's just not a great deal. So this is a card that gets drafted very, very highly. I think it looks very appealing, but just my warning not to play this card. And now we move into the problem to be solved, which is blue. So, like I mentioned before, I'm not going to write off blue as an unplayable color, but I do really think you need reasons to get into it, and you need to know the right cards to be playing. And I think that's why blue is underperforming a little bit. People are just playing the wrong cards, the cards that aren't very good, and not playing the cards that actually are pretty good. So the way I'm going to approach blue is not talk about the commons, because those aren't the start of the show. I'm going to talk about the cards that will get you into blue. The commons, or the uncommons and the rares. So I'm going to start with the rares first, actually, here. we got 4 really good blue rares. A good heuristic you can use actually is if your rare is a fairy, it's a strong card. So 3 strong fairy rares here. Talion's Messenger, the 3-mana 1/3 flyer that whenever you attack with 1 or more fairies, you draw a card, then discard a card. Then you put whenever you discard a card that way, you put a counter on a fairy you control. You don't need other fairies for this card to be good. It's just good. Twining Twins is the 4-mana 4/4 flying vigilance ward 1 with the adventure that 1 and a white to blink something. And Sleep Curse Fairy is a single blue mana for a 3/3 flying ward 2. It enters the battlefield with 3 stun counters on it, and you can pay 1 and a blue to untap Sleep Curse Fairy. Really strong card. Doesn't look all that impressive, but it's just, you put this on the battlefield on turn 1, and you've got this 3/3 ward 2 creature that's actually pretty effective. And of course, the other 2 cards I think look like they're good rares. They look appealing. Sleep Curse Fairy maybe needs a little bit of convincing or pushing in the right direction to take if you haven't played with the card before. Horned Lockwhale, another really good blue rare, is the 6-mana 4/blue 6/6 flash ward 2. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you've cast it on your turn. It's got Lagoon Breach as its adventure, 1 and a blue instant. The owner of target attacking creature you don't control puts it on the top or bottom of their library. Cards are all great. These are all A-level cards. Even the Sleep Curse Fairy, which I know doesn't really look like it if you haven't played with it or played against it. And I would take these cards happily if there wasn't a good red, black, white, green card in the pack. Right? Like, any of the cards I talked about as, some of the better cards in their colors, and I haven't even talked about uncommons really, I would take over these blue rares. Now, would I ignore a blue rare in a pack with, a C-level playable in black or red? Probably not. I do think that these cards are good, but would I recommend you take one of these blue bombs over, a C-plus level card, a red or black removal spell? Probably not. The answer is probably going to change if you're somebody who drafts a lot compared to somebody who drafts a little. Like, somebody who drafts a little bit, maybe once a week, I would say you're probably better off never touching blue. Or at least you wouldn't have a problem if you just said, I'm never going to touch a blue card. Because, well, I think there's value to be gained, and it's good to have the tool in your toolbox of drafting blue. I also think that there's a lot of baggage that comes with it, a lot of know-how, a lot of kind of setup to know how to draft blue. If you're somebody like me who drafts the set, 50, 60, 70 plus times, you're going to want to know how to draft blue, especially when you're drafting in a competitive event where that might be your lane, right? You might open that blue bomb, get past another blue card. It's good to know how to draft it. So these are the cards I'm looking to get into it for. Then we got a tier down of cards that are really strong, but I wouldn't necessarily move in for them. Number 1, we've got a rare here, Extraordinary Journey, XX blue Enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you exile X target creatures for each of those cards. Its owner may play them as long as they remain exiled. And then it also says, when 1 or more non-token creatures enters the battlefield, if it was cast from exile, you draw a card. So what effectively this is you bounce their thing, they recast it, you draw a card, and then all of the adventure cards that get played the rest of the game, you draw a card off of. A strong card, not quite on the level of the rares I just talked about, but a card that I would consider, and especially if I see it, 3rd, 4th, 5th pick, might mean the drafters at my table don't like blue, I could consider moving in. At uncommon, we've got a few ones here. Frolicking Familiar is the 3-mana 2/2 flyer that has fake prowess and the red blow-off steam adventure. Picklock Prankster. Here's one that I think is pretty underrated. 1 in a blue for a 1/3 vigilance flyer. It's got the adventure Free the Fae. 1 in a blue instant. Mill 4 cards, and you can put an instant sorcery or fairy card from among them into your hand. This is a really strong card. Like, this is a very good card on rate. You don't need to be a fairy deck. You just need to be a deck with spells in it. And 4 mana to draw a card and get some selection too out of 4 cards, and have a 1/3 flying vigilance body in installment plans. That's just a good card. This is a card that I'm happy to play in all my blue decks. And then maybe the story of the show, Hatching Plans. So this is the 1 in a blue enchantment that when it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you can draw 3 cards. Absurdly powerful if you can enable it, right? If you've got, I think you need like 6 or so bargain cards to comfortably play it, but if you can take this card, and you get it pretty late too, because not everybody can use this card, and plus people are kind of catching on that blue is not that good. It's a really strong card. So you've got those rares, you've got this pile of 4 uncommons. If these cards are the cards you're seeing early, you end up with these in the pile, what are the commons you actually want to put in your deck? So I've done a medium amount of experimenting, playing with blue myself. I haven't gone super deep. I mentioned Sam Black, who had a good podcast on blue-white. I know Sam's been drafting a lot of blue. And what I've been doing for trying to figure out how to blue works, I've been looking on 17 lands only at top player data. Part of this is because the top player data is wildly different in blue than the other colors. Like, most of the time when you look at top player data, and this is data from people that are winning, like, I don't know, it's like above 60% of the time or something, you find the data will definitely increase, like the win rate of each card goes up, but relative to how good the card is for the medium players too. Like usually the top common list is pretty similar for top players and the medium and intermediate or beginner players. That's not the case this time. The blue commons are actually wildly different, and like I mentioned before, are winning at about the rate that the other colors are at the common level among the top players. So if you're looking for stats in 17 lands, I would very much search by top players, not by just the general aggregate data. And for those top players, the two top performing commons in blue are Ice Out and Spell Stutter, both counterspell variants, right? This makes sense to me. Because blue's big issue, the reason it's bad, often people ask me, why is this color bad in this format? If I'm going to point to one thing why blue is bad, it's got a lot of cards that aren't good in its opening hand. It's got a lot of really expensive, kind of clunky-ish cards, some cards that are good but expensive, like Into the Fate Court, the draw 3. And so what you really need to do when you're playing blue, and shout out to Danelius in my Discord for diving into this data and really coming up with this conclusion. I very much agree with it. But what you need to do when you're playing blue is you need to, really heavily prioritize Spell Stutter and Ice Out, these cards that are good in your opening hand and actually do interact early. But 2, you need to be pairing it with a color that has a lot of cards that are good in your opening hand, right? Something like red with a lot of cheap interaction, or black with the cheaper interaction, and both those colors have good early creatures too. White also has, a good collection of cards that are good in the opening hand, although a little bit less good because those are proactive spells. I'm really looking for a bit more reactive spells to pair with my blue cards, my cheap interaction spells rather than efficiently costed creatures, although those are fine too. So that's what you're looking for blue, and that's why it makes sense that Spell Stutter and Ice Out are quite good. You're also looking for Into the Fate Court when you're playing blue. This is the 3 mana draw 3, make a 1/1 fairy token that can only block flyers. This is your late game, really. Like, you're not looking to play a super expensive bomb to finish the game. If you have that at rare, sure, but there's no common that really finishes the game in blue very well. Really, you're looking to just interact early and then outdraw your opponent. Make a few tokens that can maybe peck in or get sacrificed to bargain. But just the true, I've drawn way more cards than you plan. And I think Into the Fate Court's good for that plan. A few other commons you might be looking for. Quick Study, that's the 3 mana draw 2 instant speed. Sleight of Hand, that's the single mana, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand. And Johann Stopgap, this is the bounce spell for 3 in a blue, 4 mana for a sorcery. If you bargain it, it costs 2 less, and return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, draw a card. So all these cards are fine. These 3 are fine. They can fill out your deck. Ideally, though, and here's my what I've learned from playing blue. I don't want to play that many blue cards. Like, if you find yourself in a seat that should be blue, or you feel like you got the good early cards, the rares, just try to find a secondary color where you're only playing 6, 7, 8 blue cards if you can help it. Right? The blue cards that are good are good. I think the problem comes when you try to fill your deck with blue cards. So totally a fine color to draft if you have the know-how, and hopefully even me just telling you these cards that you should prioritize, and the other ones, the ones I didn't mention, the ones you shouldn't prioritize, might help you a little bit. But even with that, I'm still trying to play not that many blue cards. So that's the colors. That's the bulk of what I want to present today. We're going to finish off with a few quick hits, starting with the Enchantment bonus sheet, which has actually been a bit of a dud this kind of time around. They've been pretty good with integrating the cards on the bonus sheets into good limited playables, cards you want to put in your deck, but there's more traps than not for this bonus sheet. A lot of cards that look like you could play them, but end up just not being very good. I will call out the 2 just straight up, no questions about it, bombs on the bonus sheet, which are Bitter Blossom and Goblin Bombardment. Bitter Blossom, 1 in a black. Fairy Enchantment, at the beginning of your upkeep, you make a 1/1 fairy token and you lose a life. Just a really excellent card. This is, was a bomb back in the day, was a constructed staple back in the day, and yeah, hasn't really changed. This card's still great. Goblin Bombardment. This is the other one that I don't think as many people know about. This is 1 in a red, enchantment at rare. Sacrifice a creature, Goblin Bombardment deals 1 damage to any target. Another card that has a lot of historical context, very strong. And I think a card that people either don't know how good it is, or maybe are getting them confused with the other red enchantments on the bonus sheet that are not as good. The reason Bombardment is so strong is it both kills your opponent and makes the game unplayable for them. So, like, the main thing you're going to want to do with Bombardment is you're an aggro deck, you attack them, you got them down to like 8 or something, and usually at that point, as an aggro deck, you kind of just sit there and you're like, all right, well, maybe you have a combat trick in a turn or 2, but the board does tend to get stalled after you got them down to 8, unless you're just crushing them, right? And Bombardment just says, nope, sack my creatures, you're dead. And it also blanks your opponent's removal spells, makes it really awkward for any removal spell that, has an additional effect. It will make them fizzle. So, for example, if your removal spell also says draw a card, maybe they cast Look a Coin on your 1 toughness creature. Nope, sack your bombardment, send it at their face instead. But of course, this is any target, right? I'm just talking about face damage. That's the floor. The ceiling of this card is you've got a bunch of token makers, and you're flinging them at your opponent's creatures, go ping, 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 right? Like Harried Spearguard, the 1-mana 1/1 that dies into a rat. Fantastic card with bombardment. Same with Edgewall Pack. Anything that makes a rat, honestly, or just a token you don't care that much about, makes bombardment awesome. And even in decks without tokens, it's still a great card as long as you've got like 15, 16 creatures. Really strong card. I would highly recommend it. So compare Goblin Bombardment here, the card I'm hyping up and saying is awesome, to 2 cards that look similar, but I think are much worse, and I do not actually think you should put it in your deck. So one is Impact Tremors, 1 in a red enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, Impact Tremor deals 1 damage to each opponent. And Ray Bombardment, 2 in a red. Whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less attacks, Ray Bombardment deals 1 damage to that player or planeswalker that creature is attacking. So these are much worse for a lot of reasons. One, and the biggest one, these don't hit creatures, right? That's the big thing that Goblin Bombardment does. But 2, these are way more timing specific than Goblin Bombardment, right? You draw Impact Tremors later in the game, it doesn't do anything, like at all. You draw Ray Bombardment in your opening hand, well, it's not going to be that great, right? You're going to have to play out your other stuff first, and why not just play some combat tricks instead? Because that actually helps you get past your opponent's creatures. Ray Bombardment, what it does, it says, if you already have good attacks, you can keep attacking and deal a little bit more damage, right? That's not a very good effect. Even with rat tokens. Like, with rat tokens, they're a little bit expendable, and you don't mind just sending them in. But you don't have to put a whole card in your deck to make those rat tokens a little bit better. Same with Impact Tremors. Impact Tremors, if you always drew Impact Tremors on turn 2, and you had a very creature-heavy deck with tokens, I think you would be passable. But the fact that when you don't draw it and don't play it on turn 2, it's really, really quite bad, because any creature, you're going to dump your hand and draw it at the top of your deck. It does absolutely nothing. I can't stop you from putting these cards in your deck, and I know people like these cards, so I'm proceeding with caution here. I can't stop you from putting them in your deck if you think they're fun cards. I just would really highly recommend, if you're trying to win, these cards are not strong cards, and evidenced on 17 lands. These are some of the actual worst winning cards in the set. Impact Tremors and Ray Bombardment. And Goblin Bombardment, by the way, is like the 5th top card in the set. So just a note, just a PSA on these red enchantments that kind of look similar to each other. A few other cards that I am interested on the bonus sheet. Utopia Sprawl, I mentioned that. It's the single green mana aura that ramps you. Hatching Plans, the 1 in a blue enchantment that when it's put into the grave, you draw 3 cards. And Dragon Mantle, this is one we haven't mentioned. Single red mana for an aura. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and the enchanted creature has red. This creature gets +1/+0 until end turn. So you have your creature fire breathing. Just a solid aggro card. Like, it's good for bargaining the right way. It's a cantripping enchantment, but also makes you slap this on a 1/1, it becomes a relevant threat. You put this on a trampler or flyer. Just, pretty versatile card. Nothing wrong with it. It's not an amazing card, but I'd give it like, a C+ and about in that range. And then there's Griffin Airy. This is 1 and a white for an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life, create a 2/2 white Griffin creature token with flying. This card is a green-black card, not really a white card. You want to put it in your food decks, your decks with 6, 7, 8 ways to gain 3 life. And I think it's an effective card in that deck. Like, this is a real legit build-around. It's not just a generically good card like the last few cards we just talked about. But I do think this is a real card, but be careful. It's not a white one. It's a green-black one. And then there's, like, a bunch of other build-arounds that I don't think quite get there. Stuff like Garruk's Uprising, which is the 3 mana, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it had 4 greater power, you draw a card. Your creatures have trample, and then when Uprising enters, if you already control a 4-power creature, you draw a card. Season of Growth, 1 in a green enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you scry 1, and then whenever you target a creature you control, you draw a card. Dawn of Hope, 1 in a white. Whenever you gain life, you pay 2, and if you draw a card, you can also pay 4 mana to make a 1/1 lifelinking token. There's a bunch of cards that are like this, and if I didn't mention these cards, like if there's a card you're like, oh, I wonder how good this card is, and I haven't mentioned it yet on the just good cards, it probably isn't very good. All these build-arounds, they just don't have quite enough support. I don't think they're quite strong enough. Like, Garruk's Uprising is okay. I mean, you can put it in your deck. I see these cards as a risk, right? A risk in draft and a risk in gameplay. You draft them early, try to build around them, and, your deck might not get there. That's a risk, right? In gameplay, too. You draw this, you don't draw your other stuff that plays well with this stuff. You're going to lose a good amount of games where you just draw a bunch of unfunctional hands, right? I see these as risks. You might see them as an opportunity, right? You might be the kind of player who's like, oh, I really, kind of a Johnny style player where you're like, oh, I really want to try and make this work. I don't think these are so unassailably bad that you should never play them, right? These are the kind of build-arounds, Garruk's Uprising, Season of Growth, but there are a bunch of build-arounds on the enchantment sheet that I don't think you should try to build around if you're trying to win, but if it seems kind of cool and you want to try to win with them, they're not terrible, right? Like, my goal as a content creator, my number one goal is to get people who feel like they're losing a lot to get them winning a little bit more, right? Or the people that are winning a little bit, winning, just whoever you are. I want to help you win more. I don't think drafting these cards will help you do that. Let me put it that way. And, I know there's going to be some people out there that are like, hey, I had a great Garruk's Uprising deck. I believe you. I think you can have a good Garruk's Uprising deck. I don't think it'll come together nearly as often as it needs to for you to take it early. If you feel like you have the perfect deck for Garruk's Uprising, you're at like late pack 3, sure, take it. But a lot of these build around enchantments on the enchantment sheet are just traps. They will hurt your win rate if you consistently try to go for them. Here's a really big one. All right, so one of the best cards in the set, the best uncommon for sure, and better than most of the rares in the set, is Imodane's Recruiter. I'm sure you've most likely seen this card in action, but if you haven't, let me read it. 2 in a red for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn, and it's got the adventure Train Troops, 4 in a white, sorcery, create 2 white knight creature tokens as vigilance. I've been joking this week that this card just kills you if you look at it wrong, and it kind of does. Like, that +1 to your team in haste means that, you got that effect of Rally at the Hornburg, where you can play another creature and play Imodane's Recruiter in the same turn. They both get haste, and you can just go, boom, attack you for a bunch. This card is playable just on the red side, right? If you're just a red deck, you can just put this card in your deck, and it'll be awesome. It's still going to be fantastic. But if you have access to the white, and I would try to get some white mana in my deck with an Evolving Wilds or an Edgewell or something, it becomes a phenomenal card. The thing that makes this card really busted is it kind of just solves all the problems aggro decks ever have. Like, it's good on turn 3. If this is your third 3-drop, you attack with this, and a hasty 3/2, and your pumps your 2-drop, maybe even a 1-drop, great, that's good on its own. But it also really pushes through damage in the mid game. Really makes it so that your opponent has really bad blocks, sometimes just kills them. And the beauty of this is where aggro decks falter, where they lose, the games they lose, is when you play a 2, your opponent kills it. Then you play a 3 and your opponent kills it. Well, now you don't have any steam going and all your combat tricks get worse. If that happens to you, just go, okay, cool, 5 mana, Train Troops, make 2 tokens, cast Recruiter and maybe something else next turn. You're just way back in that game, right? Automatically. This is a single card that puts you back in that game. Fantastic top deck. Just to give you some numbers, this is winning at like 66% game in hand win rate, which again is higher than the vast majority of cards in the set. You should take this card when you see it. You're going to win more when you see it. You should splash it. I've double splashed it in some decks. Like, I've been, like a green-blue deck double splashing it. That was a deck I had a lot of incidental mana fixing, but just showing you the power of this card. Fantastic. Great card. All right, and just before we pack up, I want to touch just briefly on Archetypes. I actually don't have that much to say about the Archetypes other than just what some of the better ones are and what some of the lesser ones are. The 3 tier 1 decks in my mind are green-black, red-black, and red-white aggro. Like, green-black and red-black are both very robust mid-range to aggressive decks that also play really well in the late game. Sort of like red-black in Lord of the Rings, where it was really good early, it was good at attacking, it was good at grinding, there was really no weak point, like a good mid-range deck, I will say. Like bad mid-range decks are like piles of cards. Good mid-range decks are, I'm actually good at every single point in the game, and I think that green-black and red-black are that. Then there's red-white, which is just a phenomenal aggro deck. Like, I talked up Imodane's Recruiter, but all the red aggro cards are really strong. And one note I have, if you're somebody who likes to look at 17 lands data regarding archetypes, I would really recommend for this set to look at archetype-specific data rather than aggregate data. Because there are a lot of cards, more than average, I would say, that perform very well in one archetype, but not so well in another archetype. A really good example is Harried Spearguard. This is the 1-mana 1/1 haste that dies into a rat. This card is phenomenal in your red-black or red-white decks. Red-white really appreciates just the chip damage, having a cheap creature celebration. Red-black likes this for similar reasons. But in red-green, where, you still might be an aggressive deck, but really you're looking to attack with big creatures, not these small ones. Like, you're not going, play my 1, 2, 3, cast some removal, get blockers out of the way. You're more going like 2, 3, 4, cast some combat tricks to get my 4/4s in. Harried Spearguard doesn't play very well with combat tricks, really, And so it's much worse in green-red, for example. So if you're looking at just the aggregate data, you might look and go, oh, Spearguard's great. I'm drafting a red-green deck. I'll take Spearguard. Well, it's great because it's great in red, white, and black-red. It's not so good in green-red. So that's the kind of thing that you're going to encounter, and I've encountered a lot as I've just gone through the data. All right, that's going to wrap us up for today. Like I said, just a very brief note on those archetypes. Thank you for hanging out. I really hope this podcast gave you a bit more confidence to draft this set. It's a tricky one. It really is. It's one that I know a lot of people have had some trouble with. So hopefully this was a little bit illuminating, enlightening. Next week, I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be doing. Obviously, it's going to be Wilds of Eldraine related. Something educational and cool. I can promise that. But yeah, come back next week if you're looking for more Wilds content. And thanks so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.